One way that we've marked the passing of time during this pandemic has been with our weekly Torah readings. When Governor Pritzker initiated the stay-at-home order way back in the beginning of March, we were reading the final portions of the book of Exodus. More specifically, we were immersed in the infamous Golden Calf narrative. So much has transpired in our lives and in Torah since March. We completed the book of Exodus, read the entirety of Leviticus and Numbers, and this week we begin the fifth and final book of Torah. Here in Deuteronomy, we read not about the generation who fled slavery in Egypt, but their surviving children and grandchildren, the generations who successfully navigated the wilderness and now prepare to enter the Promised Land. This week, I'm drawn to a single verse from the very beginning of Deuteronomy that I have never seen before. After setting the scene, Moses begins his first monologue conveying God's long-awaited message to the people, saying, "You have stayed long enough at the mountain." Finally, the proverbial green light from God inviting them to leave Sinai and journey forward into the land of Israel. After 40 years of their wandering, what has been more than 3 months of Torah readings for us, finally the Israelites are granted permission to march forward. It's here that the people set forth on the next phase of their journey, soon moving physically from Sinai to the land God will show them. However, there is so much more. Our sages comment that the 40 years in the wilderness was more than the physical square miles they traversed. God's invitation to them to walk into the Promised Land comes after 40 years of spiritual and emotional journeying too, preparing them for this next chapter in their story. Deuteronomy consists of a series of farewell addresses delivered by Moses to the people. Aware of his imminent death, Moses speaks candidly, sharing advice for their journey into the land. Dr. Ellen Frankel teaches that unlike the previous 4 books of the Torah, which are narrated in the third person, Deuteronomy is narrated almost entirely in the first person, the I of Moses persistently addressing a you. Frankel observes that the word you punctuates this portion like a drumbeat, appearing more than 100 times in slightly more than 100 verses, as if Moses is addressing each of the Israelites standing before him, saying to each person gathered there, "You have stayed long enough." Like much of Torah, this text speaks to a double audience. It addresses both those who stood at Sinai all those years ago, and also speaks to each of us today, to me and to you. For each of us walks our own spiritual journey. I know from my own experience over these past few months how challenging it's been for me to move forward on that path, for the heaviness of life in a pandemic has weighed me down. It's hard to remain present in these times. There have been days that I simply couldn't recall whether it was Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday. At times experiencing overwhelming worry about my family's health, finances and well-being, and that of my friends and community. I imagine this thinking resonates with many of you as well. The spiritual toll of our many responsibilities and circumstances can be soul-crushing, halting any spiritual forward progress in its tracks. Like blinders on a racehorse, our anxieties narrow our focus and inhibit us from seeing a fuller picture of the world. Day in and day out, many of us struggle with that which we cannot control. Yet we fool ourselves into believing we still can, and in doing so, become frustrated, or worse. What we do have control over is the way we respond to life on life's terms. This past Yom Kippur, I spoke about the sermon that renowned scholar Rabbi Michael Marmer delivered last year at NSCI. Was on the life and the work of 19th century theologian Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. In it, Rabbi Marmer taught, when you wake up in the morning, there are 2 ways you can respond to the world: oi and wow. There is just about as much data as you could possibly want to support either response. You want oil? How much time do you have? We can just run down all the things that are going on in the world that could legitimately evoke that response from us. It's also so easy to take for granted the ordinary goodness in our lives. For example, when you wake up in the morning, the chances are very good that you will find yourself in a warm, dry bed. Founder of the Musar Institute, Alan Moranis reflects, "For me, after 57 years of waking up almost every day in a warm, dry bed, somehow I just don't spring out of bed in the morning and exclaim, 'Warm and dry again.' It just doesn't happen. Not because it isn't a gift to live in a secure, heated home. That's something the majority of that truth is dulled by its consistency. We become inured and don't feel gratitude for great beneficence that we simply cease to see as gifts. Even more so in those ordinary in-between times, the gray area between life's greatest struggles and our most joyous moments. That's where we live most of the time. This week's Torah portion invites us to recommit to the soul work that has become so challenging in recent months. Open our eyes and our hearts to God's beneficence. You have stayed long enough at the mountain. As we enter Shabbat, consider taking some of this time simply to clear your head and breathe, even if only for a minute or two. It's amazing what taking just 3 deep breaths can do to change your entire day, to transform the next moment. Let's try it together. Inhale and exhale. Along with prayer, service to others, investing in relationships, the other tools in our spiritual toolbox, we can broaden our world. In so doing, feed our spirit, better preparing ourselves for life's journey. Shabbat Shalom.